Peter Dirks. He was born in 1835 in Limburg, Netherlands, and died in 1921. His wife was Anna Marie VonSloane Dirks. She was born in 1837. She was the third of 11 children. She died in 1876 at the age of 39. In the 1870 census, he was listed as a farmer, age 35, and she was 33. Her occupation was keeping house. They lived in Chanhassen at that point, and they had 4 children. She died in 1876. So we jump to the 1880 census. Peter is 43. He is still living in Chanhassen, but he has now married a second time. And his new wife is Teresa. She is 26. She was born in about 1854 in Prussia. So we've got the original children from his first marriage, plus we have a new son who's just 6 months old. By the 1910 census, Peter is now 75 and she is 55. And they're living in Wright County. So remember, Peter died in 1921. She did not die until 1937. Joseph S. was born in 1838 in Bavaria and died in 1927. He immigrated in 1852, and he was 14 when he came to Chaska. In 1860, he was 20 and living in Wisconsin, working as a farm laborer. In 1862, he enlisted in the Army as a private, and he mustered out in 1865. And he enlisted from Iowa. In 1866, he married Hubertine Firkin. She was born in 1847 in Bavaria, and she immigrated with her family in 1862. She was 13 at the time. She died in 1920. Joseph founded the Chaska Foundry and Machine Shop in 1886. The shop started as a wagon and machine shop. They had 9 children. Hubertine eventually had 15 children, and 11 survived. Johann Konrad Fink, better known as Konrad Fink. He was 26 when he left Austria in 1853 and arrived in New York. On the manifest for the ship, he was listed as Bavarian. He was born in 1827 and he died in 1908. In 1855, he settled in Carver County. In Chaska, he used a lathe, and he made large and small wood pillars for home use. So you've probably seen an older home in Chaska that has pillars inside it. He was best known, however, for making beer bungs. Those were used in order to close a keg of beer. He was a charter member of Guardian Angels Church, which was formed in 1858. Family legend had it that when Konrad sailed, there were 5 eligible women on the boat. He was slow. He eventually married Wilhelmina Kelm in May 1860 in Chester, Illinois. She was born in January 1840 in Prussia. She died in 1904 at the age of 64, and she and her family had immigrated in 1853. In the 1860 census, they were living in Chester, Illinois. He was a farmer. He was 33. She was 19. And he had registered for the Union Army draft from Missouri. In the 1870 census, she was 44 and Wilhelmina was 30, and there were 4 children. By the 1880 census, he was 50, she was 40. He was still farming, and she was keeping house. There were now 7 children. William Glatzel was born in 1824. In 1850, he married Clara Hobble. He died in 1916. They immigrated in 1853 when he was 28 and Clara was 23. They left Bremen, which is in Germany, and arrived in New Orleans in 1853, and 2 young children came with them. In the 1860 and 1870 census, he was listed as a farmer. In 1870, he was 46, and she was 41, and there were 6 children at that point. In the 1880 census, he was listed as a farmer. He's 55, his wife is 51. And now we have 3 children listed. 2 children had died. And what is interesting about the 2 children that died, they died 10 days apart, meaning it was probably something like diphtheria or other disease that claimed their lives. And then 2 other children died before their parents as well. In the 1900 census, he is now a retired farmer. One of the census questions was, can you read and write? They said yes. Can you speak English? No. This was 1900. They still did not speak English. There were 9 children overall. There were only 2 that survived. She died in 1903. In 1910, he was a boarder in his own house, and he was blind. He was 85 years old, and there was a housekeeper living with him. Both the parents and the 4 children that had already died, they are buried in Guardian Angel Cemetery. This is Matthew Iltis Sr. He arrived with family in New York on September 27, 1852, from Le Havre, France, on the ship Havre. He was 48 at the time and arrived from Alsace, France. He was born in 1804. He was married in 1833 to Barbara, and he died in 1886 at the age of 84. They came with 4 children, and one of those children was Frederick Iltis. Matthias obtained a land grant that was issued in 1856 from the Red Wing Land Office, and the acreage was 71 acres plus 92 1/100ths of an acre. Very odd number. But the grant was based on the Treaty of April 24, 1820. So that's how the grant came about. In the 1860 census, he was still a farmer, and his wife Barbara was 48. And she had been born as Maria Barbara Boldensberger Ilt and was born in 1795. Remember, he was born in 1804? We got an age discrepancy here. But she died in 1881 at the age of 85. And there were 4 children. Mary Powd, she was born in 1834 in Switzerland. In the 1860 census, she was listed as age 26 with her husband Stephen and 3 children. She was a widow 5 years later with 3 children. Frederica Meyer Salter. Frederica Meyer was born in Pennsylvania in 1840. In the 1860 census, she was living with her family in Chaska. Her parents were Frederick and Elizabeth Meyer. Her father was a farmer, and she had 5 brothers and sisters. She married Fred Salter in Carver in 1867, and Fred was a laborer. In the 1870 census, Frederica was listed as a milliner. She made hats. And she had 2 children. By the 1910 census, she was living in Milwaukee. She was widowed in 1911, and she was living in Davenport, Iowa at that time. She died in 1920, and she is buried in Mount Pleasant Cemetery here in Chaska. Joseph Nicholas Schindler. He was born in 1823 and died in 1900. He and his wife Caroline were both born in Prussia. They immigrated in 1852 from Liverpool, England. Their 4 oldest children came with them. In 1856, they arrived in Chaska from Ohio. They had traveled by steamer from Ohio and settled first in St. Paul. And they reached Chaska either by taking a steamer ship on the Minnesota River, or they came overland with their oxen. In the 1860 census, the Schindlers were both 39 and are living in Chanhassen. And there were, if I count up the children right, there were 8 children. In the 1880 census, the family is living in Chaska, and Joseph is now married to Victoria Onsorg, who was a widow, and she was 49. So sometime between 1860 and 1880, his first wife Caroline had died. And the children, it's very interesting because there are stepchildren. 1900 census, he is 78, and he is a retired farmer living in Chaska. Victoria is now 69, and one of the daughters, Anna, is 36, living with them. The Chaska history book gives Caroline as the wife's name, but it's Victoria in the census because there were 2 wives, and that's just not been clear. Gerhard VonSloane, he came from Limburg, Holland in 1863 in a sailing vessel. It took them 40 days to cover the ocean, and initially when he got to Chaska, he worked in the brickyards. He was born in 1841 and he died in 1917. He was married twice. His first wife was Anna Glotzel, who he married in 1872. She had been born in Prussia in 1852, and she arrived along with her family in 1853, and she was 1 year old at the time. In 1880 census, their children were listed, and there are Mary, who's age 7, and the youngest is Gertrude, 6 months, and there are 3 other children as well. So we got 5 children. Now, she died in 1889. He remarried in 1893. 1900 census has him listed as 48, and his new wife is listed as Kate or Catherine. She lived till 1931. There are now 7 children listed, and Kate was 51. His occupation was listed as a farmer, and by this time he was also a naturalized citizen. In the 1910 census, he was 68, she was 71, so there are discrepancies in the names of the children. So it's not clear as to what happened to some of the children that are no longer listed. This is Henry Young, or Henry Jung. He was born in 1830 in Saxony, and he left home at 14 because he did not want to get into the shoemaking trade. So he became a cook, and he left at the age of 18. He left Saxony and came to New York, and he spent several years in New York working as a cook. When he arrived to Minnesota, he was working on the Minnesota River, so there are any number of types of jobs that he could have been working. He settled in Chaska in 1860, and he lived in Chaska until 1874 when he died. He was drafted in the Civil War, but there was no evidence that he served. In the 1860 census, he was 30, and he was listed as a riverman. He was married to Magdalena, who was 23, and she had been born in Alsace, France. Her father was Matthias Iltis, and her mother was Maria Barbara Baldensberger Iltis. In the 1870 census, he was listed as a merchant, and he was now a citizen. He and his wife had 4 children, and she's now going by Madeline as opposed to Magdalena. Henry had died in 1874. So by 1880 census, Magdalena is now a widower at age 42, and there are 5 children, one of whom is not listed. We don't know what happened to Ellen. She died in 1918 and is buried in Mount Pleasant Cemetery.